Hey everybody, this is Mike with BuzzTox, and today we'll be doing our reaction and review to Watchmen Episode 8, titled A God Walks into a Bar. And this is a play on the idea of Dr. Manhattan inhabiting the body of Cal Abar. This was an amazing show which provided us with a lot of answers, clever plot, good scenes with only a couple of cringe-worthy dialogue moments. Which ones made you cringe? I'd love to know, and maybe we'll tell you later which ones made me just cringe hard in the comments below. They cleverly jumped around temporally a lot in this episode, giving the audience an idea about what it would be like to be Dr. Manhattan. At the end of the last episode, it was revealed that Abar was in fact Dr. Manhattan, and although he was unaware of this fact, Angela bashes his head in and retrieves his symbol from within the front of his head, which was kind of the fail-safe to release his dormant psyche and powers. So in episode 8, we got the full backstory of how Angela and Dr. Manhattan met. Starting out in a little Easter egg on the name of the bar called Mr. Eddie's, and that's what the pregnant Vietnamese woman called the comedian in the comics before he killed her. We get the backstory of Angela and Dr. Manhattan's relationship throughout time before he eventually becomes Cal. He romances her by telling her about their inevitable future together, and we get a good review here of one of Dr. Manhattan's main abilities, and that's to be able to see and experience his entire timeline at once. This was dealt with in an entire issue of the comics, an amazing read, and they try to break it down for us within this episode. So please go and see our video on Dr. Manhattan, where we go more into the character, his backstory, and a little more depth of that power. Essentially, Dr. Manhattan's relationship with Angela was the same one that he had with both Jenny Slater and Laurie Blake in the past. They really channel the comic in their argument scene and show us how infuriating it might be to be Dr. Manhattan's partner. He gets around their relationship problems by going to Vite for help, traveling to Vite's sanctuary Karnak in Antarctica, shown in the comics. He's in shambles at this point, sitting in front of his broken TV where he used to plot to save the world, and now he blames humanity for not saving themselves with all of the answers which he's provided. We're reminded of what happened at the end of the comics with John trying to stop Vite but failing. Vite lured John into an intrinsic field generator which ripped him apart in the comics. It didn't kill him, but he was still too late to save the people of New York. In this episode, we learned that the generator was actually his plan B for taking out Manhattan. Plan A was a tachyon-irradiated device which would make Manhattan lose his memories. And tachyons are theoretical faster-than-light particles, and in the comics, they mess with John's temporal powers. It confuses his timeline. He can't see what happens next. So coincidentally, John came there to see Vite for just that same kind of device. So that's the plot turn nicely handled there. And there was a hidden reference to Vite in Cal Jelani's medical chart on HBO.com for anyone who's interested. And again, we go over that in our Dr. Manhattan video if you want to check that out. We learn next how John chose to inhabit the body of Cal Jelani. Angela offers him 3 choices of corpses to choose from that have some background history so he can inhabit a body which already existed, but she holds off on the Cal body. And I believe that this was because she knew she would be attracted to the Cal one. And maybe this was a last-ditch attempt to sabotage her own relationship with Manhattan at this point. She didn't really want to fall in love with him at this point in their relationship. After all, she still blamed Manhattan for the deaths of her parents. And I like how they threw in that little line about his vocal cords loosening up, so he sounded a little differently, and this would explain why Laurie Blake would not have recognized his voice when she met him later on. We get our time paradox about how Will Reeves believes that Judd Crawford is a member of Cyclops and the KKK. This would cause Will to go to Tulsa and eventually kill Judd. And although I love the idea of the paradox and how they put it into the show, I don't really think it was pulled off in the best fashion here. Angela discovers what she's done through talking with Dr. Manhattan through time to Will, and instead of just telling Dr. Manhattan to tell Will to not kill Judd, she just has some exposition dialogue about how she's to blame for Judd's death. And I know you might say that's not how time works and she can't change the past, But I say she still should have at least tried here. After all, she still tries to save Dr. Manhattan later, even though she's been told that she'll fail. And this brings me to another little problem that I had, and I think that many other people are going to have the same problem with it, and that's why didn't Dr. Manhattan just leave and not let himself be shot with that tachyon cannon? This is a guy with godlike powers who can do anything. He could have teleported away with Angela at any moment. And you might say it's because he's trapped in his timeline. As they say in the comics, he's a puppet who can only see the strings and he can't alter what's going to happen. But I say that that's not how things work in the Watchmen world, in the comics. John acts. He's a participant in the events around him. And yes, he can always see what happens, and he can't change it because when he tries, it happens anyway. But in this, he didn't even try. He always still tries to do something, but it still happens. He's stuck with the results of the things that happen in his timeline, but how he gets there is his own choice. He should have tried to leave, and then something stops him from leaving, so the result happens. So now the only reason I can imagine that he doesn't try is because he knows he has to die in order for some greater good, both for Angela and for humanity in the long term. So that's what I'm hoping will happen next. We learned in this episode how Manhattan's powers could be transferred. He says he could transfer his atomic components into something organic, which could then be eaten by someone who would then get his powers. Or he would still live on in them, maybe. And this is, again, it's just a big bit of foreshadowing for what we're going to see next. His powers are probably going to be trapped in an egg, because we've seen eggs everywhere in this show, and I'm betting Angela will eat it. Is that egg already in the pool? He reminded her that it was important that she see him by the pool. So is it there? We're going to get back to that pool somehow? Why do you think the pool was important? We got a lot of loose ends tied up in this episode, a lot of questions answered. We learned that Dr. Manhattan created that habitat on Europa after the end of the comic book series. We see his genesis story on Europa, the creation of the habitat, and learn all about the creatures. We learn that the creatures, and not just the humanoids, all come out of this amniotic lake within the habitat. We also learn that John's Adam and Eve were modeled after two people who had a profound effect on his childhood. These were the owners of the estate he fled Germany to with his father before World War II started. He accidentally caught them making love and is told that it was an act of creation by the woman. The woman makes him promise to one day create something beautiful. And this whole backstory is not a part of Dr. Manhattan's original storyline at all. And I'm not really quite certain why it was put in. At the end of the comic storyline in 1985, John is tired of humanity, the endless fighting, the chaos in the relationships of his life, and he leaves the planet to create a new kind of life. It's humanity's irrationalities that cause him to make life, not a promise to a British couple when he was a child. And this bothers me in that they didn't explore more of that character which was developed by Alan Moore in the comics. John's childhood is mentioned in the comics, and his character is one which is very dependent. He's led by his father in his childhood, told what to do, what jobs he should go to, what careers, and he follows. He's a follower. And then he's led by the women in his life. He never had any real direction, and that's why he was so compelling when someone like that is given such amazing powers. And I think they just kind of glazed over John's backstory in the comics to make it fit with the story they wanted to make here with him. It's still a great story, and if you haven't read the comics, it's great. It's just different, and I'm not sure how to reconcile that being a big comic lover. Anyway, in our Veidt scenes in this episode, we get a lot of mysteries solved. We see Veidt using his transportation device to make one of the squid showers, continuing his hoax in the hopes that it will still unite humanity against a common threat. We learn that John was disappointed with the subservient life he'd created on Europa. They weren't satisfying enough for him. But these docile creatures would be perfect for the aging Veidt, who was at a low when he saw John in this episode. and he liked the idea of living his final days out being worshipped. John transported Veidt to Europa, and as we know, Veidt learned to regret his choice, and just like John, saw that the creatures were unsatisfying because they didn't do anything but care for others. He saw the paradise turn into a prison. We learn that Veidt already knew about John playing around on Europa. He says an elephant told him, and this is a reference to Lady True, who's heavy with the elephant symbolism, referencing the historical Lady True. Hopefully you stuck around for that post-credits scene, which further explored Adrian Veidt, the idea that he still sees himself as a savior, a watchman for humanity. He wants to return to Earth because his job isn't done, and the people need him. We see his daily torture, where the inhabitants of the enclosure smash tomatoes in his face, asking him to stay, following their one law there: don't leave. And we learn that the game warden was actually the first creature created in this paradise. He was the Adam who watched God create heaven, so he's actually the most faithful of them all. Adrian is again given his cake, this time with 6 candles indicating how many years have gone by since episode 1. And he gets the horseshoe we saw foreshadowed in the first episode, where he said he didn't need it yet. We leave Adrian once again planning his escape. So for final thoughts here, we've got Dr. Manhattan transported to Senator Keene and the 7th Cavalry, where they'll destroy him, take his powers in some way with the help of Lady True's tech. We've got Looking Glass out there somewhere. I'm going to guess that he was saved by Renee in his bunker. We've got to see more of that character. I love that actress. And he'll likely show up disguised as a member of the 7th Cavalry at some point, saving the day, probably helping out Laurie. We've got Laurie there being held by the 7th Cavalry. And I really hope that we get a few moments with Dr. Manhattan and Laurie together, having some dialogue between one another, because I think that would make a great scene, their reunion. Finally, we've got Lady True and Will Reeves with their big Millennium Clock. So what's the agreement here, guys? Is it a giant mesmerizing device which will be a big empathy bomb for humanity? Is it a giant memory implanting device of some sort, similar to nostalgia, which might give everyone memories that Will Reeves and Lady True's have of their past? And if everyone shares the pain that they've had in the past, it will make humanity go forward? Or is it a giant memory wiping device, which will make everyone forget and move forward? A few episodes back, I thought it was just going to be a giant doomsday device, killing a ton of people on the coastlines while Tulsa stayed untouched. But now I've kind of tossed that theory out. I think Lady True is setting up Keene into thinking he's going to get Manhattan's powers when she really wants them for herself. And where was Adrian going to fit into all this once he gets back to Earth? I think he was that meteor that landed earlier on the Kent farm. We also saw him reading the same book that the Clark farm, the Clark woman was reading a few episodes back, which was actually written in the comics by one of the guy who wrote the pirate story in the comic books. If you're a big fan, that's one of the books that he's said to have written. It's a little Easter egg. Lots of questions still to be answered. Where will Adrian fit in? Is he Lady True's father? Is he Lady True's adopted father? Is she the daughter of the comedian? So many things to be answered and not a lot of time to do it. I really hope they don't leave us disappointed. Thanks again for going along this ride with us through Watchmen, and remember to like and subscribe to us here at BuzzTox. Cheers.